Hello and welcome to our presentation. Scarlet is the New Black, the utilitarian moral worth of characters in the Scarlet Letter. I'm Henry Muller.
I'm Michael Park. I'm Robb Lovelace.
And I'm Alec Vartanians.
First, we'd like to start out with a quick overview of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a philosophy invented by Jeremy Bentham. His philosophy of utilitarianism states that in any situation, the ideal course of action is that which minimizes pain and maximizes pleasure for everyone involved. Bentham put forth most of these ideas in his publication entitled An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. And Bentham described a method of calculating the amount of pleasure caused by an action. This method was called the philosophic calculus. Okay, here's some more about Bentham's philosophic calculus. According to Bentham, the more intense the pleasure caused by an action is, the longer the pleasure caused by an action lasts, the faster the pleasure caused by an action arrives, the more pleasure the pleasure caused by an action begets, the less pain the pleasure caused by an action begets, the more moral worth an action has. And Bentham actually wrote a little poem to help you remember this kind of thing. Intense, long, certain, speedy, fruitful, pure. Such marks in pleasures and in pains endure. Such pleasures seek, if private be thy end. If it be public, wide let them extend. Such pains avoid, whichever be thy view. If pains must come, let them extend to few. Then a little later came another philosopher, John Stuart Mill, and he modified Bentham's theory of utilitarianism. In his publication On Liberty, he modified utilitarianism by adding the concept of higher and lower pleasures. Higher pleasures benefit society over the long run. They're not necessarily what society wants. And lower pleasures are desired by society, but they're desired by population, but they're not what is best for society. In fact, they're definitely not. Okay, so here we have some big questions. What constitutes moral worth? Is morality subject to change within a person? How do consequences of individual actions affect morality? Well, moral worth, utilitarianism-wise, is exemplified when an individual does so to promote the greatest good for the greatest number and increase net pleasure. Since utilitarianism is consequentialist, moral worth just means some sort of action must be taken to promote the greater good, whether the action itself may be considered good or bad. How do consequences of individual actions affect morality? Well, if certain actions bring about the greater good, then their enactor has high moral worth and vice versa. Again, utilitarianism is a consequentialist philosophy, so the consequences of an action are the only things that determine its morality, not the motive behind the action, or the action itself. Morality is subject to change within a person, depending on what consequences their actions bring about. If their actions lead to higher pleasure, whether the population agrees or not, but they lead to higher pleasure for society, then the morality rises. If their actions bring about the decrease of higher pleasures, then the morality falls. And now we're going to discuss the rationale we used when evaluating the moral worth of characters for a graph. Actions that increase the net pain of society cause moral worth to decrease, obviously. And actions that increase the net pleasure of society obviously cause moral worth to increase. But if actions result in more low pleasure, they are not as elevatory to moral worth as those actions that result in more high pleasure. In short, the more useful characters in the Scarlet Letter are to society, the higher the moral worth gets. But here's a caveat. The society we are talking about here for the Scarlet Letter is Puritan New England during the 1640s, and the Puritans had their idea of an ideal society, but it's not really what we would consider an ideal society. We have this nice long quote here from John Stuart Mill that actually talks about the Puritans, and he points out that utilitarianism does in fact imply that if you have a Puritan society and the Puritans are the majority and they have a certain idea of how society should run, even if a lot of people object to it, And even if you yourself think it's wrong, it doesn't matter. Majority rules, that's utilitarianism. So yeah, Mill points out that even if the will of the majority is oppressive, utilitarianism dictates that it must be obeyed. And so, as we evaluate moral worth of characters, we'll be regarding a rigid Puritan status quo as the standard the character's actions should seek to maintain. This should not be confused with their bias against lower pleasures. Because pleasures that go hand in hand with the preservation of the Scarlet Letter as Puritan society should be seen as higher pleasures by default because they are self-evidently good for the society, and as Mill points out, the will of society trumps all. But again, true to form for higher pleasures, some people might not recognize them as good things. We even see some characters in the Scarlet Letter who don't agree with Puritan society, but it's all about the will of the majority.
So here we have the big graph of morality for the entire book. So we have Dimmesdale and kind of pinkish, and Chillingworth, who's the kind of little darker blue. So as we go through, at the beginning of the book, Dimmesdale has a very high morality, and so it continues while he lives with Chillingworth. So this continues. His basic trend throughout the book is a very high public utilitarian morality. And in the forest, although this is like private and is still his public image is still very valued by the rest of society, so that gives him a continued high morality. And even through his daring walk back into town from the forest, although like his private opinions are against what he's preaching, not many other people view him as a nonconformiter, so therefore he still has high morality. But then then at the election sermon, it's still very high. But then at the end of the book, with his confession, his value in a utilitarian perspective drops, because he's basically repudiating everything he and the social structure of Puritan Massachusetts stands for. So on to Chillingworth. In the beginning of the book, he has a relatively medium morality. You know, he comes into the prison to help Hester. He's a doctor. He knows medicine. Therefore, he's valued for that knowledge and to help, to help people. That's what doctors do. So from a utilitarian perspective, that's how he's benefiting society. And this continues through a majority of the book. While living with Dimmesdale, Dimmesdale is one of the most valued people in the society. And when he becomes sick, Chillingworth takes the responsibility to help cure, like to bring him back to health. So that is also a benefit to the greater good, to help bring Dimmesdale back to his full health so he can continue to give sermons. And the peak of Chillingworth's morality is when he foils Hester and Dimmesdale's plan to flee to Europe, because, at the beginning of the book, it's established that, the rest of Puritan society wants to seek out Hester's fellow adulterer. And so by planning to go on the ship as well, he stops their attempt to escape justice. So that's how, by preventing them, this is why it gives Chillingworth a high morality through, allowing this justice to still be achieved, potentially. But at the end of the book, by giving the property to Pearl, by rewarding her, it's basically supporting a threat to the ideals of conformity. So therefore, I'm kind of just going to go over each event more specifically. That was on the chart. So Dimmesdale's plea to Hester in the balcony speech to reveal the identity of her fellow adulterer contributes to his high utilitarian morality by acting on the general will of society. So by exposing her fellow sinner, they're purging any threats to the doctrine of this social structure, and therefore, Dimmesdale, he's conceding to it, even though he is the fellow sinner. So by acting basically as kind of like a double agent, he feels one way, but he has to fulfill his role as the upholder of beliefs that gives him a high moral worth. Oops. And there's our quote from the chapter that supports the Dimmesdale's calling out the fellow sinner. While he's living with Chillingworth, Dimmesdale's time living with Chillingworth and his discussions with him regarding sin and redemption allows Dimmesdale to reflect his own predicament. So basically, this time, this is more private conversation, and it doesn't really doesn't impact his social, his public image within society. So, some of these realizations regarding sin and redemption, Dimmesdale's inspired to give stronger sermons, to kind of reaffirm the beliefs and his position as a strong upholder of tradition. And there's our quote. So, in the first scaffold, the use of the scaffold to punish himself yields no change in his moral worth because no one is there to see that, despite the fact he is atoning for his sins. So, again, this is a private struggle that Dimmesdale is dealing with. Even if someone were there to observe it, no change in moral worth would occur because they would be oblivious to the purpose. So again, Dimmesdale is by himself, agonizing over his own internal struggle with sin. But this really has no one other than him or Hester, for that matter, understands the purpose of his conflicts. So no one would therefore be able to comprehend the purpose of doing that. So therefore, it doesn't damage his status from utilitarianism as the upholder of beliefs. Even though Hester and Pearl were there, since Hester's approval could only be reached through admission to the community, Dimmesdale's moral worth remains constant. Again, no one knows the situation at hand, so therefore, no one even suspects Dimmesdale as being the father, perhaps, except Chillingworth. So you can't make assumptions based on this, so therefore, Dimmesdale remains mostly high. Since Dimmesdale in the forest does not have direct contact with society, his morality stays static, as previously stated, though his actions with Hester in the forest are unorthodox, have no impact on society, so outside of society, it doesn't have any impact. Walking into town back from the forest, although Dimmesdale is strongly tempted to utter blasphemous and inflammatory statements as he walks through the town after the forest trip, he remains from doing so, and therefore his utilitarian morality remains unaffected. So basically the same things I've been saying, that what happens outside of society stays outside of society. There's a quote for that. The Election Day Sermon. So Dimmesdale's sermon regarding the relationship between God and humanity resonates in the audience, positively impacts his morality through the declaration that New Englanders are the elect. So a reaffirming the beliefs of Puritanism, upholding to conformity. The other society members, they agree that it's one of his best sermons. Continues to raise his public image.